Hi everyone, welcome back to the Puttering Penman. Today we're going to be talking about choosing an ideal nib size. So in this we're talking about choosing between, fine, medium, broad, extra fine, double broad, things like that, less so about like stubs and italics. Although a lot of these principles can apply to picking like say the size of the stub nib or italic nib that you want. So I have here a Pilot Falcon with a soft fine nib. It is inked with Pilot Blue. And then here I have my Pelican M120 Iconic Blue that is also inked with Pilot Blue, but it is a Pelican Steel Broad nib. So there's quite a bit of line variation between these two pens, and because I have the same ink in them, I thought it would be good to show some of these principles I'm going to talk about. Here is some handwriting practice I did before this video. Obviously the top has been written with the broad nib on the Pelican, and the bottom was written with the fine nib on the Falcon. So a fine nib tends to show the imperfections in your handwriting, and a broad nib tends to hide them. So long as your handwriting is large enough that your handwriting is legible. So one of the spots here where I made a mistake is in this P. It's not quite as rounded, and you can definitely see that in the fine nib version, but the broad nib version sort of covers that up, so you don't really notice the issue. Trying to look for other mistakes here. The underturn on this N was not as smooth as it could have been, but on the broad nib version, you're not going to really notice that difference. And so that is one thing between deciding between a fine and a broad nib. A fine nib will show the imperfections in your handwriting, but a lot of people also say that if you have nice handwriting and you write with a fine nib, the fine nib makes your handwriting look even more impressive than it would with a broad nib, because you're not really hiding the imperfections. So if handwriting is important for you, that is definitely something to consider. You probably want to go with the finest nib you can. That will make your handwriting look good. Likewise, if you are primarily working on handwriting practice with your fountain pens, you may want to go for a nib size narrower, or go with a nib size finer than what you're used to, and that will allow you to see the mistakes in your handwriting, but then also correct them while you're doing practice. And then, if you're planning to go, write for work or class notes and other things like that, you can bump up a nib size for those. But then for your handwriting practice, use something a little bit finer. So another consideration is that because fine nibs put down less ink, they are better on less expensive non-fountain pen friendly paper. And because broad nibs put down more ink, they are not as good for cheap, inexpensive paper. So this is just a junior legal pad, and you can see the broad nib here did bleed through just a little bit. Obviously if I had a double broad or triple broad or an even wetter ink in here, it could bleed through the paper and be much more difficult. Also, in terms of feathering, the fine nib didn't feather quite so much. The broad didn't feather that much either, but in general, because there is more ink coming out of a broad nib, it will feather more on inexpensive paper. But the flip side of that is that if you are using fountain pen friendly paper, this is my Maruman Nemesis notebook that I typically use for work. A broad nib and a broad nib will show off ink that shades and sheens, and in general just the color of the ink better and more vibrantly than a fine nib will. So you can see here, like, the ink is definitely darker coming out of the broad nib. I can see some shading here at the end of the A, right here in the P. This is not really a sheening ink, so you're not going to see any sheen here. But you would be able to see those properties better using a broad nib than you are with a fine. You can see with the fine, the ink is a bit lighter. You're also not picking up like shading or sheening in any of these spots. So you're really not getting any characteristics of the ink other than just the color blue. And then, of course, there's personal preference. If you have a handwriting style where either a fine nib or a broad nib could work, there is definitely a preference of deciding which one of these you like. This passage here I wrote from, for those of you who are wondering, I wrote it from Palmer's penmanship budget. I believe this was a letter from the penman H.L. Darner. But anyhow, you all looking at this probably, some of you probably lean to the preference of the fine nib, and some of you lean for a preference for the broad nib. And that's personal preference. For me, I lean toward the fine nib, I think, looking at this in person. The broad nib is also nice in my opinion. You pick up some shading and the color is very nice. The bold, I can read it from a little bit farther away. But for me, the fine nib has a certain elegance to it that I think is very nice, and that's what I would prefer for like writing a letter or doing my like note taking. But everybody's different, and I think that's sort of why this is a difficult decision for a lot of people, because you want to decide like, do you like fine nibs, broad nibs? And in all honesty, like over my decade plus collecting fountain pens, I've switched. I started at medium and then I went to broad, and then I went back to medium, and now I've the last like 2 years I've enjoyed fine nibs more, and now I'm sort of experimenting with like Japanese extra fines, so something like very, very fine. And I'm sure like over time, if you ask me 5 years from now, I probably will prefer something different, and that's okay. It's kind of why I have a variety of nibs in my collection now. So in general, I think there's sort of 4 methods you can use to decide like what nib do you want on any particular pen, or what nib do you want to use to write something. First, if you prioritize ink, I think you should choose the widest nib that will not have feathering or bleed through on the paper you're going to use. So this is, for people who prefer ink. The second category, I think, would be for people who prefer the nicest handwriting or the most impressive handwriting. And I tend to lean into this category. So choose the finest nib where your handwriting looks good. And so I think you're really only going to know this by taking out all your pens, or at least the pens you use often, inking them, writing with them, and then looking like, hey, where does my, start with the broadest nib, go down to the finest nib, and then look and like say, okay, where does my handwriting start to look a little more shaky? And I think that's one way you can decide that. The third way, I think, would be to just buy a medium nib, or like buy something in between, and like, call that, good enough for both cases. I've definitely been in that at some points in my fountain pen hobby time, and I think that's good for people who just want to have like 1 pen or 2 pens, and just have something that works for many cases. And then the fourth, I think, is to just buy both or have a variety, and then just switch based on what need you have. I typically only have like 3 or 4 pens inked at a time, so often I can have like 1 broad and 1 fine, but some people have like even more pens inked at a time, and they have like lots of color choices and nib choices. So I think, if you like write in black ink a lot, you could always have like 1 pen one broad nib inked in black and one fine nib inked in black. Sort of just depends on your use case and your preferences. So those are my thoughts on the topic. If you have questions, please let me know in the comments below. I would love to hear your thoughts as well about how you decide what nib to get on, like, say, the next fountain pen you buy, or on how you choose, like, when you're about to, like, sit down and take notes. Would be curious to know how you all make your decisions. So with that, I appreciate you taking the time to watch this video, and I will see you next time. Bye.